You know that specific moment when a task appears on the list, and the first thought is not, how do I do this? It is, who should I pay to do this? The search begins before the attempt. The quotes are requested before the difficulty has been assessed. The contractor is called before anyone has asked whether a contractor is actually required. And the specific question, the one that arrives before the search in the mind of someone who still does things themselves, is not about who to hire. It is, have I actually looked at what this involves? And if not, how hard is it likely to be? Because a task that seems professional is not necessarily a task that requires a professional. And the difference between those two assessments is frequently a question rather than a fact. And the question is almost never asked before the quote arrives. While somewhere else, someone is waiting for a callback from a service provider for a task that would have taken an afternoon, cost nothing beyond materials, and been finished before the callback arrived. Here is what almost nobody calculates at the moment of deciding to outsource something: the cost of doing it yourself. Not the cost of failure. That is a real consideration, and sometimes the answer changes the decision. Not the time required. That is also legitimate, and sometimes the hours genuinely have a better use. But the actual cost of the task itself, the materials, the time required, the actual difficulty of learning to do it, compared honestly against the fee being paid to have someone else do it instead. The room that costs $700 to have painted takes a weekend and $50 in materials. For someone who has never held a roller before and looks, after the second coat dries, like a room that was painted by someone who decided to investigate first. Not perfectly, but well enough that nobody who visits can identify who did it or whether they had ever done it before. The flat pack shelf that costs $80 to have professionally assembled takes 45 minutes with the instructions that came inside the box, a screwdriver most households already own, and the willingness to read before reaching for a phone. Nobody pays for convenience because they genuinely enjoy spending the money. They pay for it because the task appears harder than the fee makes it feel, because the price of the professional service communicates that real expertise is required, and a high price makes the job feel more specialized than it often is, and the alternative is never attempted, because the assumption of difficulty never needs to be tested once the service exists, and the number has been accepted. Researchers studying how people spend their time and money have been examining this pattern for decades. Ashley Willens and colleagues, publishing in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that spending money to buy time can increase well-being, but with an important condition. The time freed has to be used for something that genuinely produces more satisfaction than the task replaced. When people buy time by outsourcing and then use that time for leisure that produces no more satisfaction than the task would have, the purchase adds cost without adding well-being. Still doing things themselves is not the refusal to value time. It is the refusal to buy time before checking whether the time actually needs to be bought. And the decision to outsource operates alongside a second tendency that makes the apparent difficulty of unfamiliar tasks reliably higher than their actual difficulty. Unfamiliar tasks often feel more difficult than they are because the steps are still invisible. The decision to hire a painter, a tax preparer, or an assembly service is frequently made before any attempt to understand what the task actually involves, before the instructions are read, before the how-to video is watched, before the first attempt is made. Sometimes, the investigation reveals that the task is genuinely complex, and that the professional is worth every dollar. But sometimes, it reveals the opposite, that the difficulty existed in the invisibility of the steps, not in the steps themselves. Still doing things themselves is the habit of checking the actual difficulty before paying to avoid it, and finding, more often than expected, that the task is considerably more accessible than the fee for avoiding it suggested. And the numbers confirm what the finished shelf already knew. A straightforward tax return, standard deductions, single income, no unusual circumstances, can be completed with free government software in the time it would take to drive to an accountant's office and describe the situation. A room painted by someone who has never painted before costs the price of the materials and looks, after the second coat, like a room that was painted. 3 things. An economy that profits from the perception that tasks require expertise. A psychology that makes unfamiliar tasks appear harder than they are. And a question, simple, prior, free, that most people never ask before paying someone else to answer it for them. It was there, the bedroom wall. The quote had arrived at $600. Preparation, materials, labor, 2 days of someone else's availability. It sounded reasonable for what seemed like a task with professional complexity. Painting was something professionals did. The finish required training, the tools were presumably specialist. All of this had been assumed without a single question being asked. Then someone watched a 12-minute video, bought a roller, tape, a tray, and 2 tins of paint. Started with the wall behind the bed, the one nobody would see if the first attempt looked wrong. The first coat was uneven. The edges took longer than expected. The room looked worse halfway through than it had before the first stroke. Then the second coat dried. The wall looked like a painted wall. The cost was $52 and a Saturday afternoon. And it was there the realization, not about the money, not about the hours, but about what the task had actually involved. No specialized equipment, no step that required anything beyond reading the instructions, and being willing to start with the wall nobody would see first. And the understanding that followed was not just about painting. It was about the other categories where the same assumption had been made without being questioned, where complexity had been assumed, the quote had arrived, and the investigation had never happened. And the additional insight, quieter but more lasting, that having painted the wall once made every future painting quote legible in a way it had not been before. The task was no longer mysterious. Whether it was done personally or hired out, the decision would now be informed rather than surrendered. These are not people who never hire anyone. Most of them pay for professional services regularly when the task genuinely requires expertise they do not have, when the cost of error is too high to risk on a first attempt, when the time saved has a real and specific alternative use that is clearly more valuable than the task being avoided. What they do not do is outsource before the attempt, before the instructions have been read, before the how-to has been watched, before the question has been asked of whether the difficulty is real or simply assumed. They are the person who, when a task appears that could easily be delegated, asks a careful question before requesting a quote. Have I actually looked at what this involves? That is not someone who distrusts professionals. That is someone who understands that the market for convenience services is built in part on the reliable human tendency to overestimate task difficulty, and that checking the actual difficulty before paying to avoid it is the simplest form of due diligence available to anyone with an internet connection and an afternoon. They feel the pull of the service, the specific comfort of not having to learn something new, of having it done without the uncertainty of a first attempt. That pull is real. But they have learned to ask the question first and to find, more often than the market would suggest, that the first attempt was entirely sufficient. Now finally, the objection. Some things genuinely require professionals. You do not do your own dental work. You do not represent yourself in court for serious matters. You do not perform your own surgery. And time has real value. Sometimes paying for convenience is exactly the right decision. This is not about never hiring anyone. There are tasks that genuinely require professional expertise. situations where the cost of error is too high to risk on a first attempt, and circumstances where the time saved has real and measurable value. Nothing here argues against hiring, where expertise is genuinely required, or where the alternative use of time is clearly more valuable. This is about the tasks that are delegated not because they require expertise, but because they seem difficult before they are tried, and the discovery, when they are tried, that they were considerably more accessible than the decision to outsource them assumed. And the time has real value argument carries less weight than it assumes when the question is asked honestly and without self-deception. What was the time actually used for in the hours the service was hired to free? The people who still do things themselves are not rejecting professional expertise or claiming they can do everything. They are simply checking whether expertise is actually needed before paying for it. Here is what most people get backwards. The person who outsources without asking, who requests the quote before reading the instructions, who assumes professional difficulty before attempting the task, who pays for the service of avoiding something that might have taken an afternoon and cost the price of materials, is not saving time. They are spending money to avoid an assumption that was never tested, and repeating that spend across every unfamiliar task for the rest of their life, because the assumption is never tested and the difficulty is never discovered to be lower than it appeared. The person who still does things themselves is not being stubbornly self-sufficient or refusing to acknowledge the value of expertise. They are spending money deliberately after understanding the task, rather than automatically because it appeared difficult before it was investigated. Sometimes the investigation confirms that a professional is the right choice, but now the fee is buying genuine expertise, not merely relieving uncertainty about a task never examined. Many people outsource before they know whether the task is actually difficult. These people investigate first, because understanding the task costs less than outsourcing it blindly, and because finding out what something involves is almost always worth the hour before paying someone else to spare them the hour. There is a moment people who still do things themselves all describe in almost the same way. It is not the task completed, it is not the money saved or the service not hired. It is the moment after, when the room has been painted, the shelf has been installed, the task has been completed, and noticing that the thing exists, that it works, that nothing of consequence was lost in the doing of it, and that the only thing that changed was that someone asked the question before assuming the answer. Not pride in the self-sufficiency, not satisfaction at the frugality, just the ordinary clarity of a task that is finished, after the specific discovery that the difficulty existed mainly in the assumption that it did, and that the assumption had been doing considerable financial work for a very long time. The doing was never the point. What still doing things themselves said about the understanding that convenience has a price, and that the price is worth paying sometimes, but rarely automatically was. Do you still do things yourself, or does the quote arrive before the question? Drop it below. We read every single one.